Okay, we still have music going for some reason. If we could get that shut off. Awesome. Okay, so something was really weird with the audio. Okay, now this is completely weird. Stand by, guys. There is some weird audio stuff going on. Okay, well, I hear a feedback. So apparently my producer says we're good to go. We're going to be talking about Iran today. Welcome to State of Play on Midwest News. Oh, we're definitely not. You know what? We're just gonna play, the interview because, the world's falling apart and so is the technology. So there's some weird feedback, and this is an interview with Dr. Assal Rad. We're just gonna go and send it. Alright, so tonight on State of Play on Mint Press News, we're going to be talking about Iran, and I'm probably going to post this interview to my personal platform as well because it's really an important topic right now. If you don't live under a rock and you're paying attention to the news, the drums of war are beating for another potentially interventionist conflict in West Asia. Tonight, we are joined by Dr. Assal Rad, scholar of Middle East history. She works on research and writing related to U.S. foreign policy issues, the Middle East, and contemporary Iran. Her writing can be seen in Newsweek, The National Interest, The Independent, Foreign Policy, and more. She has appeared as a commentator on the BBC, Al Jazeera, CNN, NPR. She completed a PhD in history from the University of California, Irvine in 2018, and is the author of State of Resistance, Politics, Culture, and Identity in Modern Iran. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Okay, so we have been seeing this development over the past year since the onset of violence last October and the subsequent genocide that's been happening and campaign of ethnic cleansing, not just in Gaza but also in West Bank, and now the dimensions of the conflict are expanding into southern Lebanon. We've heard a lot of a lot of talking points, especially within the mainstream legacy media, about this axis of resistance, that all the terror that exists in the Middle East or West Asia, whatever you want to call it, is part of the Iranian, what I call the octopus, where you have these tendrils of influence throughout all these different countries. And there is increasing narrative push that the Iranian government is perhaps so evil we can't work with them. They're an existential threat to Israel's survival, and therefore they need to be essentially bombed. And this has been like a neoconservative talking point for quite a long time. In fact, in 2014, Dick Cheney was quoted in Salon magazine as saying his greatest regret was not invading Iran the same time that we invaded Iraq. So I guess coming into this, people are just starting to learn about Iran and its foreign policy, its government. I guess in the biggest macro picture, like what does it want essentially?
Well, to go back a little bit to what you were saying about the way that Iran is presented as an existential threat to Israel, and many times it's presented as this major threat to the United States as well. The problem with that narrative in and of itself is that Iran, the Islamic Republic, the government in Iran, is portrayed as both so weak that it's always on the brink of collapse, right? This has been a repeated sort of idea since the revolution of 1979. In fact, one of the reasons why Saddam Hussein in 1980 invades Iran is under the idea that, this is a weak post-revolutionary state and you can collapse the Islamic Republic before it's really takes off. And we know now from history that has the opposite effect. It actually legitimizes and solidifies the Islamic Republic in many ways because of that rallying around the flag effect of being invaded by a foreign country in 1980. And this logic has continued. It's the logic that informs the way that U.S. sanctions are imposed on Iran, right? It's if you just, one more sanction or one more series of protests within the country, rightful protests, I should say, from the domestic population that have their own issues with their own government. But the idea from our side is, so they're on the brink of collapse. At the same time, they are presented as an all-powerful force that's a puppet master within the Middle East and is somehow a threat to US security and national security. So it's this sort of paradox in the way that it's presented that doesn't really make sense when you think about it. So why is it presented in this way? It's so that when a policy position is to be justified, whatever that policy position is, then you take that sort of line to justify what that action is. In reality, Iran is a state that is heavily, heavily sanctioned by the United States. Iran has no equal power to do that in kind, right? It cannot reciprocate that kind of economic warfare on the United States, which is why it doesn't do it. In terms of military might and power, while within the region it might have a significant military force and has created alliances within the region that will help create those sort of defensive alliances as well. The reality is, Iran, you can see, at least dating back to 2020 after the assassination of General Soleimani by the United States, has shown restraint. They've tried to avoid larger escalations in war over and over again because they are also aware of that limitation in conventional warfare. So when you look at the way that Iran is presented, it's problematic to begin with, because it's not meant to give you an understanding of what is the actual national security threat, what is the threat level. It's meant to justify whatever policies are on the table that whether it's neocons, and you say neocons, but in reality, I mean, the Democratic Party and liberals have the same sort of policies. They have the same anti-Iran ideas. In fact, today, there was a clip of Kamala Harris answering the question of who's the number one adversary of the United States. She said Iran, which is the most bizarre answer she could have given, because most analysts, most commentators would likely pick either Russia or China as adversaries, simply because of the power dynamic, right? If China is a comparable economic power, Russia is a comparable military power because of its nuclear arsenal. Nobody would think Iran, because in reality, it's not comparable on either of those scales. But you can see that kind of anti-Iran attitude that simply informs the way that our foreign policy system operates, whether it's Democrats or Republicans.
Right. And so it was kind of cathartic to see today. I think they got a gray zone reporter into the White House press room. I'm just going to play this clip right now real quickly. I think you posted it actually on X.
Israel is still poised to strike Iran, and in July, Blinken said that Iran was 1 to 2 weeks away from developing a nuclear weapon. So I guess for all we know, they might have one by now. And meanwhile, in Ukraine, they've struck deep within Russian territory several times, as deep as 300 miles from the border. And in that case, we don't have to guess. We know that Russia has the largest nuclear arsenal on the planet, as many as 6,000 warheads. And so one of the risks of arming militaries that are striking in the territories of nuclear powers is that one of those gets deployed, and then it could escalate very quickly from there. So it's rarely discussed, but it's important to address that the nuclear risk is real, and it could very abruptly mean the end of what humans have worked for thousands of years to collectively achieve. And us today are very lucky to live with the fruits of that achievement, and I feel like we're treating the risks kind of brazenly. So my question for you is, we often hear in response to these concerns that, well, Putin, Khomeini, they're war criminals, they're terrorists, as if they're too inherently evil or immoral for us to negotiate with. But meanwhile, this administration has financed a genocide in Gaza for the last year, and every day you're up there denying accountability for it. So, I mean, what gives you the right to lecture other countries on their moral?
So if you have a policy question for me, I'm happy to take it. If you want to give a speech, there are plenty of places in Washington where you can give a speech.
Yeah, but people are sick of the bullshit in here. I mean, like, it is a genocide. You are abetting it, and you are risking nuclear war in Ukraine for this proxy war.
Okay, well, first of all, one thing about Count Chocula, Matt Miller, some think tank will eventually take him. He'll become a fellow, even though nobody really knows what that means. And then we'll see him having a mental breakdown on video at a random halal food stand sometime in the 2040s. But I think that's a really good demonstration of the contradiction of U.S. foreign policy, the massive dissonance. And I think that this consent is manufactured and these talking points get across because we have weaponized the word terrorist. It's now a word that's kind of deployed by the great powers to condemn certain types of violence and certain governments that they don't approve on. So it doesn't seem that there's a lot of critical thinking about how the average citizen should view Iran within the context of U.S. foreign policy. I guess my question then would be, we hear about this government that, as you mentioned, it's always on the brink of collapse, and then we are seeing in the mainstream media, like on CNN, Piers Morgan, they're platforming people in the diaspora that are very against the current Iranian government. And I just wanted to play this clip right now because very prominent people are speaking out against the Iranian government.
The Middle East, the cradle of civilization, is rich with stories of great kings, prophets, and philosophers. From Cyrus to Moses to Ibn Khaldun, our nations have given the world some of its greatest visionaries. Leaders like Anwar Sadat, King Hussein, Menachem Begin, King Faisal, and my father, too, took up the mantle of seeking peace for our people. But for 45 years, too many of us have been forced to live in fear. Fear of the next terrorist attack, fear of war, fear of economic instability, fear of nuclear blackmail. That's because 45 years ago, my country was taken hostage by a radical regime that seeks not only to keep my people in chains, but to export its revolution to your countries and your people.
Oh boy. So that's what we're hearing.
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack. Let's
Right.
start with the video of Liam Cosgrove, who's asking the questions to Matthew Miller in the State Department briefing. First on that, one thing and I thought Liam did a great job at to your point, sort of cathartically asking the thing or saying the words that everyone, you can see the frustration with so many of the reporters in the room. He sort of said what everyone thinks. One thing I will correct about what he said, and this is less an issue with Liam and more an issue with the way that mainstream media and even US politicians portray the Iranian nuclear program. He said that Secretary of State Blinken said that Iran is 1 to 2, I think he said, weeks away from a nuclear weapon. That's not what he said. He said 1 to 2 weeks away from nuclear breakout time. And if you don't follow these things directly, if you're not, privy to all of the information of what that means, breakout time sounds like someone has a weapon. In reality, what breakout time is referring to is the amount of nuclear material you would need to create a weapon if you wanted a weaponized program. So within the world of non-proliferation experts, right, or proliferation experts, I should say, within the world of the science of it, they say it would take between 1 and 2 years estimated for Iran to actually have a nuclear weapon and a delivery system, making it an actual nuclear, quote, threat, right? Mm-hmm. So that's the first thing to sort of keep in mind. Because what happens is when Iran is presented in this manner, the fear that's created within the public, especially in the West and in the United States, is that, Iran has a nuclear weapon, they're going to attack us right now. The very same kind of logic and fear that led to the invasion of Iraq in 2003 and the farce of weapons of mass destruction, which was not true, which we now know in retrospect as a fact was totally fabricated and a way for the US to enter into an illegal war in Iraq. That's, we still have boots on the ground in Iraq 21 years later.
Right.
So that's one thing to correct about it. The reason I say that is because while Iran is portrayed as a nuclear threat, Iran agreed to a deal between the United States, P5+1, It was enshrined in the United Nations, called the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal. It was a landmark agreement because it was the most oversight of any country's nuclear program historically. And so, because you mentioned earlier, you said, there's this idea within more hawkish circles that Iran, they're just this rogue state. They cannot be trusted with anything. They're always a threat perpetually. But that deal and the way that deal came about is a very real example of how that's not particularly true, right? The argument was Iran would never come to the table to negotiate with the United States. It did. The argument was Iran would never abide by the deal. It did. In fact, even the Trump administration certified that very deal until they withdrew from it in 2018, meaning that Iran was abiding by it. And so there are very real criticisms of the Islamic Republic, whether you're talking about their foreign policy, but especially their domestic policy and the way that they repress their own people. This is why we see multiple stages, multiple iterations of mass protests in Iran going back decades, the most potent of which we saw in 2022 that went into 2023. Those are very real grievances that Iranian people have against their own government. But when you look at this idea from the US perspective that Iran is a national security threat to us because of nuclear weapons, that is a separate issue, and that issue is not being portrayed correctly. And the parallel, in the very same way that there was rightful criticism of Saddam Hussein, the way he ran his own country, that's not the same thing as he has weapons of mass destruction and now we need to invade Iraq, right? We're conflating things that are not causal, and they're not true in certain cases. So one thing that's never talked about when you talk about nuclear threats is the fact that the only country in the Middle East that has nuclear weapons is Israel, right? The US won't even acknowledge that Israel has nuclear weapons. Iran and other states in the region have proposed the idea of making the Middle East a nuclear-free zone. There's two countries that object to it, the United States and Israel. So if the issue is national security, if the issue is non-proliferation, if the issue is we don't want more nuclear weapons, there are solutions, but that would require Israel to acknowledge that it has nuclear weapons and the United States to acknowledge that Israel has nuclear weapons, and they don't want to do that. So those are the elements that are sort of missing from that conversation. Now, the second video you showed, well, first of all, that entire sort of speech from what we heard is totally ahistorical, right? The idea that, first of all, the way that the word terrorism is used is completely loaded because, for instance, Israel's pager attacks were terror attacks in Lebanon. Even a former CIA director said that is terrorism, but nobody calls it a terror attack. You won't hear US officials say it. You won't hear the media say it. Why? Because the word no longer has meaning. It's only applied if similar actions are carried out by adversarial states. So the actions don't matter. It's who is doing the actions that matter. And certainly the idea that those types of actions started in 1979 is ahistorical and absurd. That's not true. The idea, if you noticed in his speech, the people that he named as sort of the peace-loving leaders of the region were mostly kings, right? These were all monarchies. So if you're advocating, Iran is a country where the people have been advocating for a representative democracy for over a century. They've been trying to overthrow authoritarian states, whether they were monarchies or now an Islamic Republic, since the early 20th century. So
and that brings us to the 50s. Yeah, but sorry to interrupt.
No, it absolutely does, right? So what's so ironic about that particular clip is he's the son of the king that was deposed in Iran in 1979 in a mass popular revolution. Now, whether or not people agree with what happens after the revolution, right? There's a whole history behind that, and we don't need to get into all the details, but there is, in what you would assume in a post-revolutionary state where there are internal fighting, and it was not a bloodless situation, right? There was a lot of competition that then created whatever the post-revolutionary system was. But prior to that, across the political spectrum, there were people who were against the monarchy. And it happens to also be the son of the particular king that was reinstated in power in 1953 after a US-UK coup that removed the prime minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, who was really the leader of the democratization movement in Iran. So these are the things that are very sort of odd about that kind of language and that kind of clip. But on top of that, what I would add is one of the central criticisms of the Islamic Republic that both officials in the West and Iranians themselves lay at the government is their human rights abuses, right? The repression of Iranian people.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems extraordinary to me that a figure who is supposedly advocating for human rights is also whitewashing a genocide, right? By aligning himself with Israel, by he visited Israel during the beginning stages of this war. And so when you look at that and you put it next to each other, it doesn't make any sense unless what you're seeing is people who weaponize the language of democracy, weaponize the language of human rights to push a specific political agenda that has really no consideration for any of those concepts or the consequences for ordinary people within Iran or within the region itself.
Yeah, it reminds me of my involvement in the Afghan war. No really objectives were being accomplished. It was very much a holding action. And we finally pulled out when the cycle was over. But the entire time we were there, it was the big moral issue was like women's rights because the Taliban are brutal. I'm not saying that they're not, but it was a moral issue used to justify an imperial war. And so that's kind of like when I'm asked to come on and talk about the Iranian government or the Russian government within the context of U.S. foreign policy, I usually don't make value judgments about like what's going on in there because I know it worked on me when I was younger. We thought we were saving the women, and it turns out just like bombing a country isn't really going to impact or improve human rights conditions. I've never seen that work.
So sorry, because here's the problem with that is imagine the assumption, first of all, is that like in the West, we have a great human rights record, which we don't. Like there's that first part of it that's absurd. Mm-hmm. Institutional racism in the United States is a very real thing. If you look at the incarceration system in the United States, it's essentially modern day slavery that is based on a racist system. If any country said, hey, we're going to invade you to fix this clearly flawed, human rights system that you have. Millions of people live in poverty, even though we're the richest country in the world. You have wealth inequality. I mean, there's a laundry list of things you could say to criticize the U.S. government as well. And it's domestic policies, police brutality, 1,000 people killed every year by police. That's essentially a state execution. But none of that strips the U.S. of its sovereignty. None of that means that a war, whether it's an economic warfare or kinetic warfare, would be justified against the US where there's a mass slaughter of civilians. That would make no sense to anyone, and yet that is the exact language and logic that we use when carrying out atrocities across the world.
Right. Well, it's just old colonial orientalizing language. Nothing new. I think if we're going to shift focus back onto the genocide in Palestine, I was shocked in late October. I had no idea that they would be that foolish to actually do it in broad daylight while it was being live streamed. And before we get into that, I was hoping you could maybe touch on this what Iran calls its axis of resistance, because in the legacy media it's portrayed as this kind of almost like monolithic terror alliance that's only objective is to destroy the state of Israel.
Yeah, so again, sort of nothing could be further from the truth in the sense that the way that monolith that you're talking about, that's really, really important to disentangle and understand. The way that it is portrayed in the West, and now you see this, you'll see in the news all the time, it's like Iran backed such and such group, Iran backed something. You'll never read, U.S.-backed Israeli military massacres civilians.
Right.
You'll never read that, even though technically speaking, that's true, right? If you're doing it in reverse, then also everything that Israel does is backed by the United States. And every time the Israeli military is mentioned, it should say US backed, but you don't see that. So there's that. That's the first problem. The second problem is the idea that they're sort of this puppet master, like Iran just can tell everybody what to do, all of these groups what to do, and they're, sitting there waiting to abide by their every word. That strips those groups and those people of their agency, right? They exist if you're Houthis in Yemen, if you're Hezbollah in Lebanon, if you're Hamas in Gaza, if you're series of Iraqi Shiite militias in Iraq, you have your own local and national interests. Now, where those interests align, these groups might support each other materially or in other ways as well, right? Monetarily, like the Iranian government might support these groups. Where the interests align, but where they don't align, they don't do that. So a very important example of that would be Hamas. Hamas is portrayed as sort of, they're now an Iranian proxy. Hamas and the Islamic Republic were on opposite sides of the conflict in Syria. So now how is it that an Iranian proxy that just listens to whatever the Iranian government says could possibly be on the opposite side of a conflict? Because that's not how it works, right? It's much more complicated. It also, and this is the third point that I wanted to make, it also sort of erases the idea that between these groups, there's a lot of distinction. What are their own local histories? Where did they come from? Where did they emerge from? If you're looking at Hamas, the idea is always given that, the reason there's no peace is Hamas. Well, there was decades of occupation before Hamas existed. They came into existence in the late 1980s. So that's clearly not the case. You talk about Hezbollah now because of the invasion of Lebanon. Where did Hezbollah come from? It was a consequence. It was created in reaction to Israel's invasion and occupation in southern Lebanon. So all of that is also erased in sort of this way that it's presented. So it's a very inaccurate way of presenting the information. But yes, I mean, where they are aligned, they work together because they see common interests, and where they are not, they work on opposite sides.
Right. So I don't see the narrative changing and how this is going to be portrayed in the West. I don't see any substantive difference between Harris presidency or a Trump presidency in this regard. But Trump is seen by his supporters as the anti-war candidate. How would you characterize his foreign policy towards Iran during his presidency, if he comes back in?
Well, his foreign policy towards Iran under his administration was quite aggressive, actually, right? It's the Trump administration that withdraws from the nuclear deal, the maximum pressure campaign to impose really, really brutal nationwide sanctions, what is akin to warfare because of the way that it affects the actual population, right? These aren't targeted sanctions that hurt the IRGC or the supreme leader. This is a significant portion of the Iranian middle class falling into poverty because of the impact of sanctions. That was all under the Trump administration, the assassination of Soleimani, that put us sort of at the brink of war back in January of 2020. Now, Donald Trump is not a politician by trade, and he certainly doesn't have a lot of foreign policy background. So who his advisors are is very important. And you can see that if you look at the Trump administration, they start out with Rex Tillerson as the Secretary of State. And while Rex Tillerson is Secretary of State, the US stays in the JCPOA, in the Iran nuclear deal. In May of 2018, when he changes Tillerson and brings in Mike Pompeo, Secretary of State, who is an evangelical Christian who sees an evangelical Zionist who sees, a sort of whose foreign policy is infused with fairly extreme religious views. That's when a lot of the policy towards Iran changes. Within, I think it's like 10 or 13 days, the US pulls out of the nuclear deal, and Pompeo's stance against Iran is very different. at the same time, who was Trump's national security advisor, which he also changed eventually, but originally, John Bolton. John Bolton's been writing about bombing Iran for decades. So you have people who are influencing his foreign policy who have very, very hawkish views about Iran specifically. Trump himself, if you're looking at, if we're being, and I'm not a Donald Trump fan. I've always been very critical of the Trump presidency, especially because of the policies that he had vis-a-vis Iran. But if you want to look at the record, he is more of an anti-war president than anybody else we've really seen. He did not start a new war.
Mhm.
He didn't start a new war, and he didn't really expand any wars. He, in fact, tried to, pull troops out of Syria. He tried to minimize the military footprint of the United States. And if you look at who took over after him, you would think the Democrats are sort of doves and they don't want war. And yet we find ourselves in one of the most grotesque sort of wars we've seen in the 21st century playing out, live streamed with the full backing of the Biden-Harris administration.
Yeah. And they've also set a new precedent of backing Israel unconditionally, because no other administration has done that. Even Bush bombed the crap out of Baghdad, said that on a number of occasions, Israeli strikes in Gaza were excessive. There's a famous case of Reagan picking up the phone and shutting down a military action in Lebanon. So I think they have an open reign. I think they would have it under both administrations, and U.S. policy isn't going to shift. I just keep wondering to myself, like, how long can Israel maintain this? These operational tempo, like they're stretched in Gaza, they have a multi-brigade action happening in West Bank, and now they have this nebulous buffer zone military operation, which is mostly just a bombing campaign of Beirut and the Bekaa Valley going on. I don't see how they have the infrastructure to expand into a distance shooting war with Iran. But now they were talking initially about, after the October 1st attack by a reprisal by Iran, they were talking about bombing nuclear sites. Well, first of all, a lot of those are hardened structures underground, and Israel doesn't really have the military capabilities to erase Iranian nuclear infrastructure. Plus, it would be a scary escalation as well. So now they've kind of chilled out a little bit. Now they say they're going to only focus on military targets, which is like, okay, that makes sense. The general from CENTCOM, Central Command, just returned from Tel Aviv, basically probably blessing off on a target package, we can assume. But what could Israel, by responding against Iran, hope to achieve?
Well, first, I wanted to say that you're absolutely right, by the way, about Trump and Harris. My point was to say more overall, Trump, at least based on his term as president, seems to have been less war hungry than the current administration. But what was interesting about watching the presidential debates was that it was like the one thing they agreed on, right? They competed to see who was going to be more pro-Israel. And so that is, in terms of the policies we're going to see after November, it's hard to believe that either candidate is going to try and actually stop Israel and what it's doing. Mm-hmm. But in terms of this sort of retaliation that Iran took, and now the retaliation that Israel wants to conduct, which is exactly what we saw in April, right? In April, Iran retaliated against an attack on its consulate in Syria that killed a number of its officials by Israel. Iran retaliated, gave like multiple days of warning to different U.S. allies in the region, including, say, like the Jordanian foreign minister. It was a well-telegraphed response to minimize, the actual damage. That's when you tell everybody you're going to do something, because you don't necessarily want it to have a lot of, you don't want it to create a lot of damage, because the whole point of the response is to say, hey, we responded, but we didn't do any damage, so now we can stop the escalation at this point.
Mhm.
Israel still responded again in a sort of measured way, and the escalation stopped there. So again, we're seeing that kind of cycle. Now, Iran was retaliating for a assassination of Ismail Haniyeh that was carried out in Tehran, in the Iranian capital, back in July. Why did Iran wait 2 months, more than 2 months, to respond to Israel? Because they were waiting for a ceasefire, because that's what they were told that the US was working on. And not only was there no ceasefire in Gaza, Israel expanded its war into Lebanon. So seeing that there was going to be no stopping Israel, and that actually the war was expanding to Lebanon, Iran responded. And now you see Israel again taking the stance of they're going to retaliate to the retaliation. The idea of targeting nuclear facilities is, I mean, it's a bad idea for multiple reasons. First of which is you cannot eradicate their knowledge, even though Israel has tried to do so, by the way. There's been a decades long...
Scientists, yeah.
Exactly, right? The assassination of scientists. So they've tried to do that, but that's not really how it works. Iran has the knowledge. And so even if Israel attacks the Iranian facilities and does damage to the infrastructure, Iran can rebuild. They have the knowledge to do so. But what it could do, and what it would, I mean, if you think about it from any other country's national security perspective, we would do the same thing. What it might do is prompt Iran to leave the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and to decide to have a weaponized program, believing that that's the only deterrent against that kind of threat on its own soil. So we're in this idea, we're risking Iran moving from being a country that has only a civilian nuclear program to then actually wanting to have a weaponized program, and then creating a sort of ripple effect within the region, right? If Iran has a nuclear weapon, Saudi Arabia will likely want to have a nuclear weapon.
Mm-hmm.
All of this goes against not just American national security interests, but global national security, global security interests. And so that's why that attack would be ludicrous. The other that they're thinking of targeting is Iran's oil facilities, which also serves to harm the global economy. Now, the most important action that Israel is taking that everybody in the world should care about is a genocide in Gaza. Mm-hmm. Nothing is more important than the fact that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza and is now using the same kind of language to threaten Lebanon, right? A very, very similar pattern. In fact, Netanyahu said today that warned Lebanese people, I don't know what he expects them to do, but warned Lebanese people so that Lebanon does not become Gaza, which is essentially a threat of genocide because that's what's happening in Gaza. Mm. But if you're looking at, again, the lens of, if we take that part of it out, which I don't think we should, but I'm saying even from the perspective of someone like a Kamala Harris or a Donald Trump, affecting the global economy affects ordinary Americans. When Russia wants to do something like that, right? Or Russia is accused of affecting anything that affects other people in the world, whether it's supply chains or food or global economies, this is treated as an affront to international law and the world is being taken hostage. But Israel can threaten to do basically whatever it wants. And there's not little pushback, there's no pushback from the US. The US has enormous leverage to stop Israel, but it refuses to do so under this administration.
Right. And I would just say that we do monitor like IRGC affiliated Telegram channels, and also Iranian state media has kind of like put out that if the US is involved in the strikes, Iran, and they target Iranian oil interests or facilities or refineries, that they'll do the same to very vulnerable US interests in the region. So they just, and I actually just got blacklisted of Al Jazeera after like my 4th interview last week because I was talking about the effectiveness of the Iranian strike. Like there's systemic failures in the Iron Dome, if it's because the attack achieves saturation or depletion of the Iron Dome's ammunition, but they put rounds on target on at least 3 different bases. So that was a fraction of their arsenal. We don't know how long they can sustain that kind of rate of fire, wave after wave after wave, to achieve target devastation, but our bases are completely vulnerable. oil interests are completely vulnerable. They can shut down the Strait of Hormuz. And if you don't like gas prices now, they're going to surge right before an election. So this entire policy stance is incredibly self-destructive to the current administration. And it's kind of wild that they won't put any brakes on it because there is no there's no end game for Israel. I guess their end game is to just keep this going as long as possible to, save Netanyahu's career in some nebulous way and also ethnically cleanse northern Gaza. Because remember, while this whole will they, won't they bomb Iran conversation is going on, they've reopened the invasion into northern Gaza. They intend to clear everybody out in northern Gaza. They literally they just bombed the last bakery in northern Gaza. They just destroyed it. And they're going to create a military control zone and going to try to push everybody out of the north. So that seems to be underlying, and to your point, everything that they're doing on a wider, more strategic level is to give themselves cover to continue doing to Gaza what they have been doing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when you say there's no end game, this is a criticism that commentators have all the time. It's like, so what is the end game? There's no explanation of what the end game is, right? Israel does not explain it themselves, except when they make genocidal comments. Then you see, well, that makes sense as an end game, right? If your end game is you just want to seize more land and expel more Palestinians, then it starts to make sense. But in any other scenario, their actions make no sense. If the idea is they're going to reoccupy southern Lebanon, then the actions make sense. But the idea that there's no, what is the goal besides war itself? And sometimes people forget that is in fact a reality. Look at, you talked about Afghanistan earlier. Look at Afghanistan. What was the point of that? What was the 20 years of war in Afghanistan? What was the point? What was the end game? They had to change it because they failed at it, right? Biden had to come out and say, well, we were never going to be nation builders. Doesn't matter if the Taliban took over again after, a couple days. So it's just that the logic that is presented doesn't work because that's not the reality of why they are doing what they are doing. In the case of someone like Netanyahu, it's a combination of personal political ambitions to stay in power and avoid being held accountable within his own state's legal system, and also just this very right-wing, zealous attitude of conquest that we see on the Israeli side. The idea of Greater Israel, the fact that they want to annex the West Bank and take Gaza and build settlements in Gaza again. I mean, that is what the end game is, but that's something that no one really wants to talk about, that it is actually about land seizure and conquest and ethnic cleansing. I mean, no one wants to talk about amongst Western officials and media.
Yeah, it's going to have long-term consequences for the world going forward. We've had a number of fun things established now because warfare is like law insofar as you need to be concerned about what precedents to set and what precedents not to. Well, now genocide is a completely acceptable precedent. Also, the state policy of intentionally targeting and bombing hospitals, journalists, aid workers, and that changes the face of modern warfare going forward forever. There's no undoing that. So I was speaking of Afghanistan. I was there. Well, actually, this is slightly after I got out. The 2015 Kunduz hospital bombing that made international news, and that was a massive faux pas and an international catastrophe that the Obama administration signed off on. And now that's never going to be as big of an issue going forward because, again, it's been normalized. So now that we've touched on, yes, they don't have any definable strategic or operational objectives. What do you see panning out over the next few days before we end here?
I tend not to like to make predictions because you're dealing with people. One of the things that I sort of say is this very much looks like a fight in like a kindergarten playground. And I know it sounds maybe like I'm simplifying it or I'm mocking it, but that's the reality of it. You have people with personalities who are making decisions without thinking about the consequences for anyone else. And what it looks like Israel is going to do is carry out an attack on Iran that it thinks will deter Iran from responding in kind, in all likelihood. If that is coming with any U.S. pressure, which I think there is. I mean, I will say that I do think the Biden administration would like to avoid a war with Iran, because very differently than every other situation, if Israel and Iran confront each other directly, I mean, the ramifications are very, very difficult to predict. But who would have thought in 2003 that we would still have boots on the ground in 2024? Well, actually, a lot of people. They said this was going to be a disaster, and it turned out to be. And so this a war with Iran, a full-scale war with Iran, would be much, much greater in terms of disaster than Iraq. It's simply a larger country. It has a much larger population. The Islamic Republic is more entrenched and has a stronger security apparatus than Iraq had at the time of, or than Saddam Hussein had at the time of the invasion in 2003. So it's what I hope is that the U.S. actually did pressure Israel to respond in a measured way that does not attack Iran's oil facilities, that does not attack their nuclear sites, and that it stops there. At least this cycle stops there. But what I will say is that none of this will change, right? This idea that the Middle East is sort of inherently violent is absurd and racist. And this is what you hear from US officials. None of it will go away until the core issue is addressed. And the core issue is not even Gaza, right? That's not the core issue. That is the most important pressing issue right now in this moment. But the core issue is Israel's occupation. As long as Israel is allowed to illegally occupy millions of people, millions of Palestinians, control their lives in an apartheid state, put sieges and blockades so that they can't control their own borders, as long as they're annexing land and building more settlements, as long as this is happening, there can never be, a peaceful resolution. And that is the core issue that any real broker, which is not the US, they've proven that they cannot be, that is the issue that has to be addressed.
Right. Well, it's not going to get addressed anytime soon, unfortunately. I think we're further away from the ceasefire now than we were even a few months ago. But we'll see, and we'll just keep analyzing and commenting on the situation as it progresses. This has been Dr. Assal Rad. She is the academic and author of State of Resistance, Politics, Culture, and Identity in Modern Iran. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. I appreciate being here.
Yeah. Well, all right. Well, have a good night, and we will see you guys on the next one. Okay. Well, that was a great interview. We're literally having so many technical issues going on right now. I'm lagging super hard. Well, that was a great interview. The audio is coming back and I can't mute it. So guys, sorry, we're going to miss our Q&A, but I'll make it up to you next time somehow. So that was a primer for understanding Iran so you're not gaslit by the war machine. So this has been State of Play on Mint Press News. Again, technology is great when it works, but we will be back next Monday, and hopefully not a bunch of crazy crap happens this weekend. All right, appreciate y'all. Sorry we're missing the live Q&A this time. It's just tech issues, guys. All right, cheers, guys.